just talked to Sir Iain Duncan Smith about this. He's former leader of the Conservative Party, and he joins us. Good morning to you, Sir Iain.
Good morning.
I'm assuming you were as thrilled as I was when you heard the news about this watering down his net zero commitments, but probably also as confused as I am by the idea that he's still committed, the Prime Minister, to the net zero by 2050 target, but he's basically not going to follow through on any of the policies that we've been told were vital to achieve it.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't get too worried about the net zero target statement by the Prime Minister, because the truth lies always in the detail. So I have for some time, well, forever, been opposed to the 2030 target because it is irrational and it is unachievable. And the same goes for gas boilers. So petrol and diesel cars and gas boilers. The result of all of this kind of net zero religion has been that we were driving the cost up on the backs of some of the poorest in the country. They're the ones that will be most affected by this. The answer to net zero is not, I believe, electric cars, because they are inflexible. And, by the way, we're seeing greater emissions from them through their brake wearage and the tyre wearage, which is more toxic than petrol and diesel emissions through their tailpipe.
Yeah. And of course, the batteries are made in China. Yeah, the cars are largely made in China as well.
I was going to come to that because the cars are much heavier, that's the point, and damage to the roads has gone up. So there have been significant consequential costs on that anyway. And finally, also, as you say, what we're doing is driving out industry from the UK into the hands of China. Now, I think China needs to be looked at. China has the largest and growing emissions in the world. India is second, I think. We are the lowest emitter in the whole of the top 5 nations. I mean, literally the lowest. And we're still beating ourselves up. And the second thing is that it's very important. China was about to flood us with cheap electric cars made using coal-fired power stations and other oil and gas processes. And so the result was we were going to salve our consciences by letting China do the polluting on an even greater scale. Not, of course, you'd think like net zero, these characters who wander around the motorways stopping the traffic would ever care to bother to think about anything on the global front. They just think about us doing it. And the reality is it was a sham from start to finish. So, you know, I love the idea the Prime Minister has gone to his inner skeptic, which I absolutely do believe is there, and recognised the costs and the people it will fall upon are a disaster. And the ULEZ thing in Uxbridge was the best example of what happens when you say to people, yeah, we all want to clean the environment, but we're not going to issue a punishment beating to all of you on the way in there, which is exactly what we were about to do. That lesson looks like it may have been learned. Hallelujah.
Well, indeed. I mean, this is the thing. Thank God everyone's woken up. The key thing, it involved voters waking up to what politicians have done to us. Theresa May still has an awful lot to answer for. I've always likened this to, you know, the selling of indulgences, medieval religious times, when basically if you were rich, you could get away with any sin at all. You'd tell the police, and then you would be sold. You'd pay a lump sum. The church was getting very rich on it, but you'd be absolved of your sins because you were rich enough to basically buy them away. And that is effectively what our carbon emissions target was going to be. We can import anything we want. We can get rid of all of our industry and therefore not be actually putting much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from our geographical location. But then we will pay another country to produce in coal-fired power stations and factories goods which are then shipped over in oil tankers to our country. And then we can go, aren't we wonderful? It's an absurd, the worst kind of virtue signaling that achieves nothing other than basically throwing away the British economy, British energy security, our military might, because if you can't make steel in your own country, you're not a very strong military power, and also basic jobs in this country. We're going to throw away our industry. In terms of the line this draws between Labour and the Tories, some are saying, well, you know, this is a vote loser. The Prime Minister, I mean, The Guardian, The Mirror and the BBC and Sky are saying, oh, Tory MPs are unhappy about this. I mean, maybe Caroline Noakes and similar people who aren't really Tories anyway, I'm sure. I mean, I'm always delighted if she's unhappy about something. It means it's a good idea. But most MPs on the Tory benches, I think, would be very, very happy about this, going at least some way to winning back votes. But this dividing line, is this about winning the next election because he's realised, like, after the ULEZ vote in Uxbridge, this is a vote winner? Or is this about basically not losing the election as badly next year to Labour and leaving Labour with a situation where they have to own these policies. If they say, oh, it's terrible you've watered down these net zero commitments, we're going to basically strengthen them back up, then they have to own the economic fallout of that.
I think it's a combination of all of these things, really. The main point is I genuinely believe that Rishi Sunak has always been sceptical in his heart about these objectives, which have become absolutely fixed. Always a mistake to fix things like that to such a degree that you can't debate it. It's completely bonkers to say we have to stick to these when you can't achieve them. The UK has very high energy costs as a result of these determinations to go forward. Nobody wants to know that we use up more gas energy as a result of wind power, because wind power sometimes doesn't blow, a lot of the time doesn't blow, and you have gas power stations now on standby, which we never used to have before we relied on wind. So a little bit of reality and logic comes in, because there's this sort of net zero got religion nonsense where you daren't criticize anything, because what happens is you get these usual morons on the line who then attack you all and say, God help us, you know, you don't care about the planet.
Yeah. What about your children? What about your children and grandchildren?
Well, exactly. We get that thrown at us. And the reality is that Rishi Sunak was faced with an absolute point, which is Europe has gone to 2035, with, by the way, with exemptions beyond that, particularly for Germany. America's doing the same. We'd have been the only developed country in the world that was going to administer a global punishment beating on ourselves, just so that we could say, actually, our virtue is great, but in fact, we don't have jobs, people can't afford to live here, house prices have gone up, food prices have gone up, but in the meantime, we do feel better about our lives.
Yes, and the Prime Minister
can haven't affected the climate at all.
No, and the Prime Minister can look very, very pleased with himself or herself on the world stage. Can I ask you also about other couple of stories very briefly? The EU, obviously, always in the news. Starmer having just met with President Macron in Paris, although Keir Starmer has ruled out as a non-starter the possibility of the EU having these new sort of concentric circles of 3 different tiers of membership, and us being in the 3rd tier as an associate member. He says that's a non-starter. Do you agree?
I just worry about Keir Starmer traipsing around all over the place talking to people. He went to Europol the other day, who promptly told him, no, you can't come back into us. You'd have to take more migrants as part of the deal. So that would look really popular back in the UK. He's then gone over. Macron's talked about putting the squeeze on the UK. His pound of flesh would be almost certainly fishing and others, where we'd have to give back so much of that we won in the hard way when we voted Brexit. This is a peculiar game that he's playing out, and one I think is going to be damaging to him. The public that voted to leave absolutely expect us to deliver on that, and the advantages of delivering of lower regulations and of being able to trade and set up trade deals will all be lost straight away. Yep. That has to be done and accelerated, and that's the key. So Keir Starmer's kind of virtue signalling in Europe isn't going to work. I mean, I set up an organisation called IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. We have a lot of European members of it. It's all together about the threat of China. But when you talk to them on the sidelines about all of this, they say, you made a decision, you should get on with it.
Stick with it, indeed. Can I also ask you about migrants? The cost of migrant hotel costs, the channel migrants coming across there, is now gone up from 6 million a day to 8 million a day. It's according to few Home Office figures. This, by the way, at the same time as people smugglers have basically halved the cost of a channel crossing, because apparently the lack of demand from Albanians, who now know they're going to be sent straight back to Albania when they're caught here, that has meant that the demand has gone down, and the supply is there with all the boats, so the price has gone down. You know, capitalism working its way. But what do you make of those huge extra costs for the taxpayer here in the UK?
Well, it's the big issue. It's the big problem. Resolving this is a way of lowering that cost on those who cannot afford to pay it. And again, rather like net zero, politicians have been too glib about the reality that it is, in fact, the poorest people, the people that can least afford it, that are going to pick up most of that bill, and it's a disproportionate bill completely. So all of that is critical. But you know, the honest truth is, when he goes to Europe, what does he find? It's a continent that is beset with migration problems. I mean, Giorgia Meloni the other day down on one of our islands the other day, watching as now more migrants live on those islands than official residents. Yeah. They're getting absolutely punished by this because they're landing there and then heading to the rest of Europe. So we've just got to get it right. We have to stop this. We cooperate necessarily with our neighbours. Holland has been fantastic cooperative. France has not been as cooperative.
No.
So getting that right is important, not wondering about whether or not we can rejoin the European Union.
Absolutely. Iain Duncan Smith, really good to talk to you.